He came to fix the wires in her rundown motel, just another late-night job. But when she whispered, "Kiss the star," with those sharp hazel eyes locked on his, everything shifted. What she does next will unravel them both in ways he never saw coming. The rain was a living thing, clawing at my windshield as I nosed my battered hatchback into the gravel lot of the Blue Anchor Motel off Route 12. It was pushing midnight, and the neon sign above the office flickered like a dying star, its green glow bleeding into the puddles on the asphalt. I was 23, scraping by as a freelance electrician, chasing cash jobs wherever they popped up. This one came from Mitch, a guy I barely knew, who swore the motel's owner needed urgent wiring work in one of the units. Cash up front, he'd said, and with my rent looming, I wasn't about to argue. I grabbed my toolbox from the passenger seat, the cold metal handle biting into my palm, and stepped out into the deluge. My boots sank into the muddy gravel, water seeping through the seams as I jogged toward the office. The building was a squat, peeling thing, its paint chipped like old nail polish. A bell jingled as I pushed the door open, and the air hit me, stale coffee, damp carpet, a faint trace of cigarette smoke that clung to the walls. Behind the counter, a woman stood with her back to me, arranging keys on a pegboard with deliberate care like she was solving a puzzle no one else could see. She turned, and I stopped dead. Her name, I learned later, was Nora Fielding. She was tall, maybe in her late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair pulled into a loose bun that looked like it had been thrown together in a rush. Her eyes, a piercing hazel, caught the dim glow of the desk lamp, sharp and unyielding, but there was a softness there too, like a bruise you don't notice until you press it. She wore a burgundy sweater, frayed at the cuffs, that hugged her frame in a way that made my throat tighten. Her jeans were practical, faded, but they fit her like they'd been tailored. She didn't look like she belonged in this run-down motel, yet she carried it like it was hers. "You the electrician?" Her voice was low, steady, with a gravelly edge that made my chest hum for no reason I could pin down. "Yeah, Ethan Parrish." I brushed water off my jacket, trying to shake the chill. "Mitch sent me. Said you had some wiring issues?" She nodded, stepping out from behind the counter with a grace that didn't match the sagging linoleum floor. "Room 14. Lights flicker, outlets keep tripping the breaker. Been a headache for weeks." She grabbed a key from the pegboard, her movements quick but precise, and motioned for me to follow. "Hope you don't mind the rain." I didn't, but I kept that to myself. We stepped back into the storm, her leading the way across the lot to a row of low, weathered rooms with faded blue doors. The motel was a ghost town. No cars, no guests, just the relentless patter of rain and the faint buzz of a vending machine tucked in the corner. She unlocked room 14 and flipped the light switch. The bulb overhead sputtered, buzzing like an angry insect, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The room smelled of mildew and old wood, with a single window that stared out into nothing but black. "See what I mean?" she said, crossing her arms and leaning against the door frame. Her posture was casual, but there was a weight to it, like she was holding the whole place together with her presence. I set my toolbox down on the worn carpet, the clank of metal louder than it should have been. "Yeah, I see it." I crouched by the wiring panel in the corner, trying to focus on the job. The room was small, claustrophobic, with a chipped dresser, a sagging bed, and a nightstand that looked like it had seen better days. I could feel her watching me, not in a way that felt judgmental, but like she was measuring something. Me, maybe, or the moment itself. It made my hands unsteady, and I fumbled my screwdriver, cursing under my breath as it clattered to the floor. "You're younger than the guys Mitch usually sends," she said after a moment, her tone light but probing, like she was testing the waters. I glanced over my shoulder, catching her eye for a split second before looking away. "Not that young," I said, though at 23 I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. "Been doing this since I was 18. My dad taught me." She made a small sound, a hum that felt like it carried more than agreement. I went back to the wires, stripping insulation and checking connections, but the air felt heavier than it should have. Her presence was a pulse in the room, steady and inescapable. Every time I moved, I was aware of her, her arms crossed, her boots tapping lightly against the floor, the faint rustle of her sweater as she shifted her weight. I didn't know why it mattered, but it did. The breaker panel was a nightmare, a tangle of wires that looked like they'd been spliced together by someone who'd given up halfway through. "This is going to take a while," I said, more to break the silence than anything else. "Whoever worked on this last didn't give a damn." "Sounds about right," she said, and there was a bitterness in her voice that made me pause. "This place has been falling apart for years. I'm just trying to keep it from collapsing." I looked at her then, really looked. She was older than me, no question, probably pushing 40, though she didn't carry it like most people would. There was a strength to her, a quiet resilience, but also something fragile, like a crack in a mirror that only shows in the right light. Her face was beautiful, not in a polished way, but in the way that comes from living, from carrying pain and still standing. I wondered what her story was, what kept her here in this crumbling motel, but I wasn't bold enough to ask. "You own this place?" I said instead, keeping my eyes on the wires. "Inherited it," she replied, her voice flat, like she'd said it too many times. "My dad ran it for decades, built it from the ground up. When he got sick, I came back to help. Then he died, and it became mine, for better or worse." The way she said it, like it was both a duty and a cage, hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, not sure what to say, and focused on the panel. The rain kept hammering outside, and the flickering light made her shadow dance across the wall, long and sharp. I moved to the outlets next, testing each one with my multimeter. One sparked when I touched it, a quick flash of blue that made me jerk back. "Careful," she said, stepping closer, too close. I could smell her now, a faint mix of lavender and rain, and it sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the outlet. My pulse kicked up, and I hated how obvious it felt. "I'm fine," I said, sharper than I meant to. She didn't step back, just stood there, her arms still crossed, watching me with those eyes that saw too much. I could feel the heat of her, like a lamp left on too long, and it made my hands clumsy again. "You're good at this," she said after a minute, her voice softer, almost warm. "Most guys would have thrown their hands up at that mess by now." I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It's just wires. They don't lie." "Unlike people," I almost added, but caught myself in time. She laughed, a short, quiet sound that hit me like a spark. "You'd be surprised what even wires can hide." I didn't know what she meant, but the way she said it made me want to find out. I finished the last outlet, the light steady now, no buzzing or flickering. The room felt brighter, cleaner, but the air between us was still thick, like the calm before a bigger storm. I stood wiping my hands on my jeans and turned to face her. She was leaning against the dresser now, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood, her eyes locked on mine. "Looks like you're done," she said, but she didn't move toward the door. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tremor I couldn't place. "Yeah," I said, my throat tight, "all fixed." She nodded, but her gaze didn't waver. "You want a coffee or something? You're soaked, and it's late." I should have said no. I should have grabbed my tools and bolted for my car. But her eyes, sharp but soft, like she was daring me to stay, made me nod. "Sure, coffee sounds good." She led me back to the office, her boots crunching on the gravel, the rain now a soft drizzle. The neon sign buzzed louder, its green light pooling in the puddles. Inside, a coffee maker sat on a table in the corner next to a stack of mismatched mugs. She poured 2 cups, handing me one without asking how I took it. Black, bitter, exactly what I needed. We sat at a small table, the silence stretching out like a tightrope. I didn't know what I was doing here, sipping coffee with a woman I'd just met, in a motel that felt like it was one bad day from falling apart. But I didn't want to leave. Her presence was a weight, not heavy but undeniable, like gravity pulling me closer. "So, Ethan," she said, her voice curling around my name in a way that made my stomach twist, "what's a guy like you doing fixing wires in a place like this?" I laughed, caught off guard. "Trying to pay rent, mostly. What about you? Running a motel doesn't exactly scream dream job." Her smile was small, almost sad. "It's not, but it's mine." She looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "I used to live in the city, you know. Had a whole different life. Graphic design, late nights, bars that didn't smell like mildew. Then my dad got sick, and I came back. Haven't left since." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a quiet truth that made my chest ache. I wanted to ask more about the city, about the life she'd left behind, but the way she held herself like she was bracing for something told me to let it go. We talked for a while, the conversation light but careful, like we were both feeling out the edges of something dangerous. The weather, the town, the way the highway got quiet after midnight. But every word felt like it was pulling me closer to her, to whatever this was. Her laugh, when it came, was rare but real, and each time it happened, I felt like I'd earned something precious. Then, out of nowhere, I said it. "You know, you're like a movie star, running this place all by yourself, like you stepped out of some old film, holding it all together." Her eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I thought I'd gone too far. But then she leaned forward, just slightly, her lips curving into a smile that was equal parts challenge and something softer, something that made my heart stutter. "Kiss the star, then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, sharp and daring, like she was testing me. My breath caught. The room felt too small, the air too warm. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her, trying to figure out if she was joking or if I'd just stepped into something I wasn't ready for. Her eyes held mine unblinking, and the weight of that moment pressed down on me, heavy and electric. This was only the beginning. I had no idea how far she'd go in just a few hours. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I gripped it like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the moment. Nora's words, "Kiss the star, then," hung in the air like a live wire, sparking and dangerous, daring me to touch it. Her hazel eyes hadn't left mine, and that smile, sharp and unreadable, sent my pulse hammering through my veins. I was 23, a kid playing at being an adult, and every instinct screamed at me to laugh it off, grab my toolbox, and run. But my body wouldn't move. The office of the Blue Anchor Motel felt smaller now, the air thick with something I couldn't name, something that made my chest ache and my hands unsteady. "Bold thing to say," I managed, my voice rough, betraying the calm I was trying to fake. I set the cup down, the ceramic clinking too loudly against the table, and leaned back in my chair, hoping the distance would clear my head. It didn't. Nora's smile didn't fade, but her eyes softened, like she'd caught a glimpse of something in me I didn't even know was there. "You started it," she said, her tone light but laced with a weight that made my stomach twist. She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, and walked to the counter, putting a few feet between us. The movement was casual, but it felt deliberate, like she was giving us both a moment to breathe. "You want another coffee, or are you good?" I shook my head, more to shake off the haze than to answer. "I'm good, thanks." The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sound softer now, a faint patter against the office window. The neon sign outside buzzed, its green light pooling on the linoleum floor, casting her silhouette in sharp relief. She was older than me, late 30s, maybe 40, though she carried it with a quiet grace that made the years feel irrelevant. There was a tiredness in her posture, a weight she wore like a second skin. But her eyes were alive, sharp, watching me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Grabbing my jacket from the back of the chair, the leather damp and cold against my fingers. "I should get going," I said, the words feeling heavy, forced. "Long drive back to Millwood." It was a lie. My rented room was barely 10 minutes away, a cramped space above a laundromat on Carver Street, but I needed an excuse, a way to break whatever this was before it pulled me under. Nora turned, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed in that way that made her seem both guarded and open. "Millwood, huh? That's a ways out. You sure you're okay driving in this mess?" Her voice was steady, but there was something in it, a thread of concern maybe, or something else I couldn't pin down. "I've driven in worse," I said, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. Her question wasn't just polite, it was a hook, tugging at something in me I didn't want to admit was there. I could have left, should have left, but the way she looked at me, like she was waiting for me to decide something, held me in place. "Stay for a bit," she said, her voice soft but firm. Not quite a request, not quite a command. "The roads are slick and I don't need you wrapping your car around a tree because of me." She paused, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't read, then added, "Besides, I could use the company." My hand was on the doorknob, the cold metal grounding me, but her words stopped me cold. Every rule I'd ever set for myself, keep it professional, don't get involved, don't linger, was screaming at me to walk away. But there was a crack in her voice, a quiet vulnerability that made me let go of the knob and turn back. "All right," I said, dropping my jacket back on the chair. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "But only if you've got something stronger than coffee." Her laugh hit me like a spark, low and real, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Now you're talking." She reached under the counter and pulled out a bottle of bourbon, its amber liquid catching the light as she set it down with two mismatched glasses. "Don't tell me you're one of those guys who can't handle a real drink." "I can handle it," I said, a grin tugging at my lips despite the knot in my stomach. She poured, her movements smooth, practiced, like she'd done this 100 times. The bourbon glinted in the glass she handed me, and I took it, our fingers brushing for a split second. It was nothing, just a graze, but it sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric. We sat again, closer now, the small table barely enough to keep us apart. The bourbon burned going down, a slow fire that steadied my hands, but did nothing for the chaos in my head. We talked, the conversation weaving through safe ground. Old cars, the way the town's diner never got your order right, the vending machine outside that ate quarters like candy. But every so often our eyes would meet and the air would shift, like a wire sparking before it catches flame. I told her about my dad, how he'd taught me to strip wires before I could tie my shoes, how he'd died 2 years ago in a hospital bed, leaving me with a toolbox and a stack of bills I was still trying to outrun. She listened, her gaze steady, her silence pulling more out of me than I'd meant to give. "My turn," I said after a while, the bourbon loosening my tongue. "What's your story, Nora? You don't strike me as the type to be stuck in a place like this." Her smile faded just for a moment, and she looked down at her glass, swirling the liquid like it held secrets. "This place is all I've got left of him," she said finally, her voice low, almost reverent. "My dad. He built it from nothing, ran it until the day he died. I was in the city, graphic design, late nights, a life that felt like mine. Then he got sick, and I came back to help. Never left." There was no self-pity in her words, just a quiet truth that hit me like a punch. I wanted to ask more, about the city, about the life she'd abandoned, but the way she held herself, like she was bracing for the next blow, told me to leave it alone. Instead, I leaned forward, my elbows on the table closer than I should have been. "You make it work," I said. "This place, it's got character, like you." Her eyes flicked up, sharp and searching, and for a moment the room was too small, the air too warm. "Careful, Ethan," she said, her voice teasing but with an edge. "You're gonna make me think you're flirting." I laughed, but it came out unsteady, my heart pounding too loud. "Maybe I am," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she leaned forward, her elbows mirroring mine, her face closer now, close enough that I could see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her hair was starting to slip from its bun. "You're trouble," she said, but there was no accusation in it, just a quiet acknowledgement, like she was seeing me for the first time. I held her gaze, my throat tight. "You're not exactly safe yourself," I said, my voice lower than I meant, the bourbon and the moment making me bolder than I had any right to be. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room was silent except for the hum of the neon sign and the faint drip of water outside. Her lips parted, just slightly, and I thought, God help me, I thought, she might lean closer. But then she stood, breaking the spell, and walked to the window, her back to me as she looked out at the empty lot. The green light framed her, turning her into something almost unreal, like a figure from one of those old films I'd mentioned. "It's late," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with something that sounded like regret. "You should get some rest. Room 12's clean, empty, no charge." I wanted to argue, to say I'd be fine driving, but the truth was I didn't want to leave. Not yet. Her offer wasn't just kindness. It was an invitation to stay in her orbit, even if just for a night. "Thanks," I said, standing, my legs heavier than they should have been. "I'll take it." She handed me the key, her fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, just a touch, but it felt like a live wire against my skin, sharp and searing. I pulled my hand back too fast, and she noticed, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't read. Amusement, maybe, or something deeper. "Get some sleep, Ethan," she said, turning back to the counter, her voice steady but soft. "I'll see you in the morning." I nodded, grabbing my toolbox and jacket, and stepped out into the cool night air. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the lot to room 12, the key heavy in my hand. The room was small, clean, with a single bed and a lamp that cast a warm glow over the walls. I dropped my things and sat on the edge of the mattress, my head spinning, not from the bourbon, but from her. Nora Fielding, with her sharp eyes and her quiet pain, was trouble in a way I hadn't seen coming. I was just a guy fixing wires passing through. She was a woman tethered to a dying motel, carrying a past I could only guess at. We were nothing to each other, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already started. I lay back, the springs creaking under me, and stared at the ceiling. Her voice echoed in my head, "Kiss the star, then," and I wondered if it was a joke or a dare, or something else entirely. The room was quiet, but my mind was loud, replaying every glance, every word, every moment where the air had felt too heavy. I didn't know what I was doing here, but I knew I wasn't leaving without finding out. What she does next will change everything for both of us. I didn't sleep. The bed in room 12 creaked every time I shifted, its springs groaning under my weight like they were as restless as I was. The ceiling was a map of water stains, each one a different shape, mocking me as I lay there, staring up, Nora's voice looping in my head. "Kiss the star, then." It was past 2 a.m., and the Blue Anchor Motel was a void of sound, save for the occasional drip from the eaves outside, a faint reminder of the storm that had passed. I was 23, too young to be caught up in whatever this was, but my chest was tight, my pulse uneven, like I'd swallowed something jagged and alive. Her face kept flashing in my mind, those hazel eyes, sharp and soft all at once, The way her lips curved when she said my name, the faint tremor in her voice when she dared me to cross a line I wasn't sure I understood. Sat up, running a hand through my hair, the strands damp with sweat despite the chill in the room. My toolbox sat in the corner, its scuffed metal glinting faintly under the lamp's warm glow, a reminder of why I was here: fix the wiring, get paid, move on. But Nora Fielding wasn't just a job. She was older, late 30s, maybe 40, with a quiet strength that made her seem both unbreakable and fragile, like a glass sculpture you're afraid to touch. She carried this place, this crumbling motel off Route 12, like it was a piece of her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something bigger than a late-night repair call. I pulled on my boots, the leather stiff and cold against my feet, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, the gravel lot slick and gleaming under the faint moonlight. The neon sign buzzed, its green glow casting long shadows that danced across the asphalt. The office light was still on, a soft yellow spilling through the window, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. She was awake. The thought made my heart kick up, a mix of nerves and something heavier, something I didn't want to name. I crossed the lot, my boots crunching louder than I liked, each step feeling like a decision I wasn't ready to make. The bell jingled as I pushed open the office door, and there she was, sitting behind the counter, a stack of receipts spread out in front of her, a pen dangling loosely between her fingers. She looked up, startled, her eyes widening for a split second before softening into something warmer, something that made my throat tighten. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, setting the pen down with a small clink. Her voice was low, careful, like she was feeling out the edges of this moment as much as I was. She wore the same burgundy sweater, its cuffs frayed, and her hair was coming loose from its bun, a few strands framing her face in a way that made her look younger, softer, but no less guarded. "Something like that," I said, leaning against the door frame, mimicking her stance from earlier without meaning to. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but my hands were restless, shoving into my pockets to keep from fidgeting. "You're up late." She shrugged, gesturing to the receipts with a tired half-smile. "This place doesn't run itself. Bills don't pay themselves either." There was a weariness in her tone, but her eyes were sharp, watching me like she knew I wasn't here to talk about the weather. I stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind me. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the faint tang of bourbon from earlier. "Need a hand?" I offered, nodding at the papers, though I knew it was a flimsy excuse. I didn't care. I just wanted to be here, near her, even if I didn't understand why. She raised an eyebrow, her smile turning wry. "You're an electrician, not an accountant, Ethan." "I'm versatile," I said, a grin tugging at my lips despite the knot in my chest. "Give me a shot." Her laugh was soft, real, and it hit me like a spark, cutting through the tension. "All right, Ethan Parrish," she said, her voice teasing but warm. "Pull up a chair." I dragged a stool from the corner, its legs scraping against the linoleum, and sat across from her at the counter. The space was cluttered. Receipts, a calculator, a coffee mug with a chipped rim, a notepad filled with numbers in her neat, slanted handwriting. She started explaining the motel's bookkeeping, a chaotic system of invoices and handwritten notes that made my head spin. I didn't understand half of it, but I nodded along, watching her hands move, the way her fingers curled around the pen, the way her brow furrowed when she talked about the motel's debts. We worked for an hour, maybe more, sorting papers, tallying numbers, our elbows brushing occasionally, each touch a small shock that made my pulse jump. It was mundane, almost domestic, but there was something intimate about it. Sitting close, our voices low, the world outside reduced to the hum of the neon sign and the drip of water. Every so often our eyes would meet, and the air would crackle like a wire about to spark. I made a dumb joke about tax forms, and she laughed, her head tilting back, her throat exposed for a moment that felt too private, too raw. I looked away, my face hot and focused on the receipts, but my hands were shaking now, just enough to notice. "You're good at this," she said at one point, leaning back and stretching her arms. Her sweater rode up slightly, revealing a sliver of skin above her jeans, pale and smooth, and I forced my eyes back to the papers, my throat dry. "Not the numbers," she clarified, her voice light but pointed. "Keeping things steady." I met her gaze, and there it was again, that pull, that unspoken thing that made my heart thud too loud. "Steady's my middle name," I said, trying to keep it light, but my voice came out low, too serious, betraying everything I was trying to hide. She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned forward, her elbows on the counter, her face closer to mine than it had any right to be. "You're not steady, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You're trouble." The words echoed her earlier ones, but they landed harder now, heavier, like a truth we'd both been circling. My mouth went dry, and I leaned in too, just enough to feel the warmth of her breath, the faint scent of lavender and bourbon. "Maybe I'm not the only one," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them, raw and honest. For a moment we were frozen, the silence so loud it drowned out the neon buzz outside. Her lips parted just slightly, and I thought she might close the distance. But she stood abruptly, breaking the moment, and walked to the window, her back to me, as she stared out at the empty lot. The green light framed her, turning her into a silhouette, sharp and untouchable. "It's late," she said, her voice softer now, almost fragile. "You should get some rest. Room 12's clean, no charge." I wanted to argue, to say I'd be fine driving, but the truth was I didn't want to leave. Her offer wasn't just kindness, it was a tether, keeping me here in her orbit for a little longer. I stood, my legs heavy, and took the key she offered, her fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, just a touch, but it burned, a live wire against my skin. I pulled back too fast, and she noticed, her eyes flickering with something, amusement maybe, or regret. "Get some sleep, Ethan," she said, turning back to the counter, her voice steady but laced with something that made my chest ache. "I'll see you in the morning." I nodded, grabbing my toolbox and jacket, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, sharp, and the gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed to room 12. The key felt heavy in my hand, like it carried more than just access to a room. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space small but clean, the lamp casting a warm glow over the walls. I dropped my things and sat on the edge of the bed, my head spinning, not from the bourbon, but from her. Nora Fielding, with her sharp eyes and her quiet pain, was a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. I was just a guy fixing wires passing through. She was a woman tied to this place, carrying a past I could only guess at. We were nothing to each other, but something had shifted tonight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I lay back, the springs creaking, and stared at the ceiling. Her voice echoed in my head, "Kiss the star, then." And I wondered if it was a joke, a dare, or something else entirely. The room was quiet, but my mind was loud, replaying every glance, every word, every moment where the air had felt too heavy. I didn't know what I was doing here, but I knew I wasn't leaving without finding out what came next. What she says next will break everything open. "And neither of us will be ready,"